Chapter 1: Child of the Steppe. The boy who would become a storm. The wind of the steppe never stops. It carries the scent of dry grass and the distant rhythm of hooves. Out here, there are no walls, no borders, no safety. Only strength defines existence. And on a cold day near the Annan River, a child was born. His name was Temujin. No one knew then that his name would one day make the world tremble. Temujin was not born into luxury. No palaces, no silk robes, no prophecies spoken over his cradle. He was born among nomads who survived by moving, hunting, and enduring. His family belonged to the Borjigin clan. His father, Yasuge, was a tribal leader, but not a great Khan. His authority was fragile. His mother, Holin, was a woman forged by hardship. She had learned the brutal logic of survival. Temujin's childhood had no concept of safety. He grew up in constant motion. Horses were companions, bows were toys, and hunger was a familiar presence. From a very young age, he learned to ride, not for sport, but to survive. He fell often, dragged across rough grass, but each time he stood up again. Weakness meant death. One of Temujin's earliest memories was hunger, the kind that twists your stomach and clouds your mind. There were days when his family survived on roots and small fish, and there were days when they had nothing at all. But worse than hunger were people. The steppe was dangerous because of betrayal. Tribes formed alliances and broke them just as quickly. Oaths meant little. Temujin grew up watching his father live in this fragile balance, both a leader and a target. One day, his father took him on a journey. It was to find him a wife. Among the Mongols, marriage was not about love, it was about alliance. He met a young girl named Bort. They were just children. They did not understand the future being arranged for them. Yasuge left Temujin there, as was custom. That decision would save his life. On his journey home, Yasuge was poisoned. Old enemies recognized him. They slipped poison into his food. He died slowly, painfully, and he never returned home. When the news arrived, everything collapsed. Temujin's family no longer had protection. Their tribe abandoned them. They left Holin and her children behind in the wilderness. No food, no allies, no future. When Temujin returned, he was no longer the son of a chief. He was just a boy cast aside. Life after that was no longer childhood, it was survival. Holin became the pillar of the family. She taught her children how to dig for roots. She taught them how to hunt small animals, how to find life where others saw nothing. She did not teach them to be kind. She taught them not to die. Temujin learned quickly, but he also changed. The softness of childhood disappeared. In its place grew something colder, something watchful, something dangerous. One day, hunger and tension within the family reached a breaking point. Brothers began to fight over food. And then, the unthinkable happened. Temujin killed his half-brother, not out of hatred, but out of survival. That moment marked the end of his childhood and the beginning of something else. On the steppe, innocence is a luxury no one can afford. Only survivors remain. Temujin was no longer a boy. He was becoming exactly what this world demanded: ruthless, resilient, unforgiving. The years of hunger, betrayal, and abandonment carved a truth into his soul. No one is coming to save you. If you want to live, you must become strong enough. And one day, he would return, not to ask for what was lost, but to take everything. The wind still blows. The steppe remains silent. But somewhere within a thin, sharp-edged boy, a storm is rising. The steppe does not forgive weakness. Temujin had already learned that through hunger, abandonment, and blood, but the world was not finished with him. It would test him again, more brutally than before, and this time it would bind him in chains. After the death of his father, Temujin's family survived, but survival was not safety. Power ruled the steppe, and Temujin had none. Among those who once followed his father were the Taishiyat, a rival faction who saw not a helpless boy, but a future threat. They came without warning, silent, riders cutting through the grass. Temujin could not resist. He was captured, judged without words, and condemned without mercy. They locked a wooden kang around his neck, a heavy frame that pinned his head and crushed his movement. It was more than a restraint, it was humiliation, a declaration that the son of a leader had become less than an animal. Days blurred into nights. He could not lie down properly, could not defend himself, could barely endure the insects crawling across his skin. He was fed just enough to live, watched constantly, mocked openly. A broken boy, they thought, a life already finished. But Temujin did not break. He did not beg, did not cry, he observed. He studied the guards, their habits, their weaknesses, who drank too much, who grew careless, who drifted into sleep too early. He memorized the camp, the direction of the wind, the rhythm of night itself. Even in chains, he was preparing, because he understood one simple truth: if he stayed, he would die. The opportunity came on a night without a moon. Darkness covered everything. One guard lingered to close young, distracted. Temujin moved with sudden violence, striking and breaking away, dragging the heavy wooden frame with him as he ran into the blackness. Behind him, the camp erupted, shouts, movement, the sound of pursuit. The hunt had begun. He ran not with speed, but with will. The wooden kang slammed against his body, each step tearing at his strength, his breath burning, his legs threatening to collapse. Still, he kept moving. The tall grass swallowed him, the cold air cut through him, and yet he did not stop, because stopping meant death. Eventually, his strength failed. He stumbled toward a riverbank and collapsed into mud and reeds, hearing voices in the distance, growing closer. There was nowhere left to run, so he chose something else. He disappeared. Sliding into the freezing water, he submerged his body beneath the surface, leaving only his nose above the reeds to breathe. The cold pierced him, his muscles locked, his lungs strained, but he remained perfectly still. The search party passed nearby, their torches flickering across the darkness, their voices sharp and searching, but they did not see him. Time stretched endlessly until, at last, silence returned. When he emerged, he was barely alive, shaking, frozen, exhausted, but alive. Fate met him there. A man named Sorkinshira found him. He could have betrayed him, could have earned favor, could have ended Temujin's story where it stood. Instead, he chose differently. He saw not a prisoner, but a boy worth saving. He hid him, fed him, and finally removed the wooden kang. For the first time since his capture, Temujin could move freely, but something had changed. The chains were gone, yet their mark remained. Temujin carried with him a new understanding, deeper than hunger, sharper than fear. Power decides who is hunted and who hunts. When he returned to his family, he was no longer the same boy. He had seen what it meant to be powerless, to be owned, to be nothing. And in the silence of his own mind, he made a promise, cold, unspoken, absolute. Never again would he be chained. Never again would he depend on mercy. Never again would he be weak. One day, he would not run, others would run from him. The steppe had tried to break him. Instead, it had forged something far more dangerous. A survivor, a mind that watches, a will that does not bend. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the world was still unaware of what was coming. Chapter 3: The Making of a Leader. Alliances forged in fire. Power on the steppe was never inherited. It was taken. Temujin returned from captivity with nothing. No tribe, no army, no status. Only a small, starving family and a name that no longer protected him. But what he did have was something far more dangerous: memory. He remembered betrayal. He remembered weakness. And now he understood the one truth that governed the steppe: no one survives alone. So he began to build, not an army, not yet. First, he built trust. The earliest followers of Temujin were not warriors of legend. They were outcasts, strays, men with no place, shepherds, hunters, abandoned sonspeople who, like him, had been discarded. Temujin did something no leader of the steppe had done before. He treated them as equals, not by blood, but by loyalty. Among the first to stand beside him was Bawarku. Their meeting was simple, almost insignificant. Temujin had lost his horse, and Bawarku helped him recover it. But instead of parting ways, Bawarku chose to stay. Not because Temujin was powerful, but because he saw something in him, something worth following. Another soon joined, Delme, a young man who would later risk his life again and again for Temujin. These were not alliances of convenience. They were bonds forged through shared hardship, through mutual survival. Temujin was no longer alone, and that changed everything. But power does not grow quietly, and the steppe does not ignore rising strength. Temujin knew that to survive, he needed more than followers. He needed legitimacy. So he turned to an old connection, his father's ally, the powerful leader, Togrul, known as Khan of the Carrot. Temujin approached him not as a beggar, but as a son. He reminded Togrul of his bond with Yasuge, invoked loyalty, invoked the past, and it worked. Togrul accepted him, for now. But even more important than this political alliance was a personal one, a friendship. Temujin reunited with Jamuka, his childhood blood brother, his Anda. In Mongol culture, this bond was sacred, stronger than family itself. Together, they rode again. Together, they dreamed. Together, they began to gather strength. For a moment, it seemed as though Temujin's path would be one of unity, not conflict. But the steppe does not allow two suns to share the same sky. The turning point came not from ambition, but from loss. Temujin's wife, Bort, whom he had once been promised as a child, was taken. The Merkits attacked. They came suddenly, like all steppe, raids fast, brutal, decisive. Temujin could not stop them. He could not protect her. And once again, he was forced to confront the same reality. Powerless men lose everything. But this time, he would not remain powerless. Temujin did something different. He asked for help. He turned to Togrul. And for the first time, he did not stand alone in the face of his enemies. They answered. What followed was not just a rescue, it was a declaration. A combined force struck the Merkits with precision and fury. The attack was swift, overwhelming. The Merkits were crushed, scattered across the steppe, and Bort was returned. But something else returned with her, something larger, respect. Temujin had proven something fundamental, not just to others, but to himself. He could lead, he could unite, he could win. The men who followed him saw it clearly now. He was not just another survivor clawing his way through chaos. He was becoming something more, a center of gravity, a force that drew others in. But with growth came tension, because not everyone believed in Temujin's vision. Jamuka, his blood brother, began to see the difference between them. Jamuka believed in tradition, the old aristocracy of the steppe, where power belonged to noble bloodlines. Temujin believed in something radical, that loyalty mattered more than lineage, that a man's worth was not decided by birth, but by action. This idea was dangerous, revolutionary, unforgivable. The steppe began to divide, not by tribe, but by ideology. Some followed Jamuka, the keeper of the old ways. Others followed Temujin, the breaker of them, and though they had once sworn brotherhood, war was now inevitable. Temujin stood at the edge of something irreversible. He had followers, he had allies, he had begun to reshape the rules of power itself. But he also had enemies, more than ever before. Because when you begin to change the world begins to resist you. The boy who once hid in the river was gone. In his place stood a man who could gather loyalty, command action, and inspire belief. But he was not yet a conqueror, not yet a legend. That would come next, through blood, through betrayal, through war. The making of a leader was complete. Now the steppe would decide what kind of leader he would become. Chapter 4: Blood and Brotherhood. When oaths turned to ash, brotherhood on the steppe was sacred, but it was not eternal. Temujin and Jamuka had once sworn themselves as blood brothers, bound beyond family, beyond tribe, beyond ambition. They had shared food, shared dreams, shared a vision of rising above the chaos of the steppe together. But the steppe does not allow shared destiny. It demands dominance. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the bond between them began to fracture. The difference was not in strength, it was in belief. Jamuka believed in the old order, the aristocracy of the steppe, where noble lineage determined power, where the sons of great clans ruled by right of birth. To him, the world had a structure, a hierarchy that must be preserved. Temujin rejected that world. He elevated commoners, rewarded loyalty over blood, promoted men like Bawarku and Gelm, men who would never have risen under the old system. He built something new, something dangerous. To Jamuka, this was not innovation, it was betrayal. At first, the divide was quiet, a disagreement here, a tension there. But tension on the steppe does not remain hidden, it grows. The final break came not with a battle, but with a decision. Jamuka was declared leader by those who followed the old ways. He accepted the title of Genghis Khan, Supreme Khan. It was a direct challenge, not just to Temujin, but to everything Temujin was building. And just like that, brotherhood ended, war began. The first clash between them was not yet the war that would define history, but it was brutal enough to reveal what both men were willing to become. Jamuka fought like a traditional noble, his forces organized by lineage, his command rooted in hierarchy. Temujin fought differently, flexible, adaptive, merit over birth. He did not just lead warriors, he led believers. The battle was fierce. Arrows darkened the sky, horses screamed. Men died not for survival but for vision. And when it ended, Jamuka won. Temujin was defeated, scattered, forced to retreat. But what followed revealed more about Jamuka than the battle itself. To make an example of his enemies, Jamuka ordered a punishment so brutal it would echo across the steppe. He had young men, followers of Temujin, boiled alive, not killed in battle, not executed quickly, but destroyed slowly, deliberately. in agony. It was a message, a warning, a declaration of what power looked like under the old order. And it worked. Fear spread. Some abandoned Temujin, some questioned him, some wondered if Jamuka was right, but others remembered. They remembered how Temujin had treated them, not as tools, not as expendable bodies, but as equals, and that memory was stronger than fear. Temujin did not collapse after defeat. He adapted, he learned, he understood something critical. This war would not be won by strength alone. It would be won by loyalty, by structure, by something deeper than tradition. He began to reorganize his forces not by tribe, not by bloodline, but by units of tens, hundreds, thousands. A system based on discipline, not heritage. It was revolutionary, and it worked. Men who had never mattered before now had a place, a role, a future, and they chose him. The steppe was changing, slowly, violently. Jamuka still had power, still had prestige, still had the old world behind him, but Temujin had something else, something new, something far more dangerous. Momentum. The war between them was no longer just personal. It was ideological. Two visions of the world colliding, one rooted in the past, the other reaching toward something unknown, and there could only be one outcome. Somewhere beyond the horizon, tribes began to watch, to choose, to shift, because they understood what was coming. This was no longer a rivalry. This was the beginning of a transformation. The steppe would not remain divided forever. One man would unite it. One man would define its future. And as the fires of conflict spread across the grasslands, the question was no longer whether Temujin would rise, but how much blood it would take to get there. Chapter 5: Unifying the Tribes. One people forged from many. The steppe had always been divided, clans against clans, tribes against tribes. Alliances formed in the morning, broken by nightfall. For generations, unity had been impossible, not because it was undesired, but because no one was strong enough to enforce it. Temujin intended to change that, not by asking, but by taking. After his defeat by Jamuka, Temujin did not disappear, he evolved. He understood now that survival was not enough. To survive on the steppe was to remain vulnerable. To be safe, he would need something greater, total control. He began by strengthening what made him different. His army was no longer organized by tribal identity. Instead, he enforced a strict decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, breaking apart old loyalties and replacing them with a new structure built on discipline and merit. A man no longer fought for his clan. He fought for Temujin. This was more than military reform. It was psychological warfare. By dissolving tribal divisions within his ranks, Temujin created something the steppe had never seen before, a unified force. But unity is never given freely. It must be imposed. Temujin turned outward. One by one, he began to confront rival tribes, not always with battle, but always with a choice: submit or be destroyed. Some chose submission. Those who did were not slaughtered. Instead, they were absorbed. Their warriors were integrated into Temujin's system. Their leaders, if loyal, were rewarded. If not, they were removed. This was not conquest for destruction. It was conquest for consolidation. Others resisted, and for them, Temujin showed no mercy. Entire tribes were wiped out, leaders executed, bloodlines erased, not out of cruelty alone, but as strategy. The steppe learned quickly that resistance did not lead to negotiation. It led to annihilation. Fear spread faster than any army. and fear worked. But fear alone does not build an empire. Temujin understood that loyalty must be stronger than terror. So he offered something new. Under his rule, even the lowest-born man could rise. Skill, courage, and loyalty were rewarded. Promotions were earned, not inherited. A shepherd could become a commander. A nobody could become indispensable. To the outcasts of the steppe, this was not just opportunity, it was revolution. Men did not just follow Temujin because they feared him. They followed him because they believed in him. One by one, tribes began to fall in line. Some through defeat, some through choice, some through inevitability. Even old alliances shifted. The powerful Togrul, once Temujin's ally, began to see the danger. What he had once supported was now becoming something uncontrollable, a rising force that no longer needed him. Suspicion turned to tension, tension to hostility, and eventually to war. Temujin did not hesitate. The conflict with Togrul was decisive. Once a protector, now an obstacle. Togrul was defeated, his power broken, his influence erased. It was a clear signal. Temujin would not share power, not with allies, not with rivals, not with anyone. The final obstacle remained: Jamuka. Their conflict had already reshaped the steppe, but now it would end it. Jamuka's forces weakened, his allies faded. The old order, once dominant, began to collapse under the weight of Temujin's relentless rise. Eventually, Jamuka was betrayed not by enemies, but by his own men. They delivered him to Temujin, bound, defeated. The moment was heavy with history. Two boys who had once sworn brotherhood now stood at opposite ends of destiny. Jamuka did not beg, he did not plead. He asked only one thing: to die without blood being spilled, a noble death. Temujin granted it. It was not mercy, it was respect. With Jamuka's death, the last symbol of the old steppe died with him. There were no more equals, no more rivals, no more divisions that could challenge what Temujin had built. For the first time in history, the Mongol tribes were one. Not loosely allied, not temporarily united, but forged together through fear, loyalty, and an unbreakable system. Temujin stood at the center of it all. No longer a boy, no longer a survivor, but something far greater. A leader of a people who had never before been one people. The steppe was no longer chaos, it was becoming a machine. And soon, that machine would move beyond the horizon. Chapter 6: The Birth of Genghis Khan. When a man becomes a legend. The steppe had been conquered, but conquest alone was not enough. Victory in battle creates power, but power without recognition is fragile. Temujin had united the tribes, crushed his enemies, and reshaped Mongol society. Yet he was still, in name, only a leader among many that was about to change. In the year 1206, the tribes gathered, not as rivals, not as scattered factions, but as one people. They came from every corner of the steppe: warriors, chieftains, elders, men who had once fought each other, now standing side by side. Horses stretched across the horizon. Banners moved with the wind. The air carried something unfamiliar to the Mongols: unity. This was not a meeting, it was a declaration. At the heart of the gathering stood Temujin, the boy who had been abandoned, the prisoner who had worn chains, the survivor who had risen from nothing. Now, he stood before an entire people waiting for him to become something more. The Kurultitha great assembly began. Voices rose, names were spoken, deeds were remembered. Not just victories in battle, but the transformation of the steppe itself. Temujin had done what no one else could. He had ended the endless cycle of tribal war. He had created order, and order demanded a ruler. One by one, the leaders of the Mongol tribes stepped forward, not as equals, but as followers. They raised him up and gave him a new name, Genghis Khan. The meaning was vast, interpreted as universal ruler or oceanic leader, a title that suggested destiny beyond the steppe. This was not just a promotion, it was transformation. Temujin was no more. In his place stood Genghis Khan, but a title alone does not build an empire, it defines it. And Genghis Khan immediately began to shape what his empire would become. He did not return to the old ways, he destroyed them completely. The tribal identities that had once divided the Mongols were permanently dismantled. Loyalty was no longer tied to clan or bloodline, it was tied to the Khan. His decimal system of organization was enforced across all levels of society, ensuring that no tribe could rise independently again. This was not just unity, it was control. But Genghis Khan understood something deeper than control. He understood order. From that understanding came the foundation of his rule, a legal code known as the Yassa, though not written in the way later civilizations would record law. It was absolute in its authority. It enforced discipline, loyalty, and structure. Theft, betrayal, desertion, these were no longer tribal disputes. They were crimes against the state. Under Yassa, even the powerful could be punished, and even the lowborn could rise. This was the paradox of Genghis Khan's rule. It was ruthless, but it was fair. Merit became the currency of power. Generals were chosen for ability, not ancestry. Loyalty was rewarded with promotion, wealth, and trust. Disobedience was met with swift, uncompromising punishment. The message was clear: serve well and rise, fail and disappear. But Genghis Khan's vision did not stop at governance. He was already looking beyond the steppe. For the first time, the Mongols were not just surviving, they were expanding. Scouts were sent outward, intelligence gathered, trade routes mapped. Neighboring civilizations, once distant, were now targets of interest. China, Central Asia, Persia, the world beyond the steppe had walls, cities, empires. Genghis Khan saw none of these as barriers, only as opportunities, because what he had built was unlike anything those civilizations had ever faced. An army that moved like the wind, a command structure that functioned with precision, a people united not by fear alone, but by purpose. The steppe was no longer the limit, it was the beginning. And yet, even as he stood at the height of his power, something remained constant. Genghis Khan never forgot where he came from. He remembered the hunger, the betrayal, the chains, and those memories shaped every decision he made. He trusted few, rewarded loyalty fiercely, punished betrayal without hesitation, because to him the world was still the steppe, just larger. The coronation of Genghis Khan was not the end of a journey. It was the start of something far greater. An empire had been born, not from wealth, not from tradition, but from survival, vision, and absolute will. And soon, that empire would begin to move. Chapter 7: War Without Mercy. The storm breaks beyond the steppe. An empire born in the steppe could not remain within it. Genghis Khan had united the Mongols, forged them into a single war machine, and imposed order where chaos once ruled. But unity without expansion is fragile. A warrior people, once still, begins to fracture. Old rivalries return, old divisions reappear. Genghis Khan understood this. So he gave his people a new direction. Outward, to the south, lay a civilization unlike anything the Mongols had ever faced. The Jin dynasty. Wealthy, fortified, structured, a world of cities, walls, and armies that did not move like the wind, but stood like stone. To most, it would have seemed untouchable. To Genghis Khan, it was inevitable. The campaign began not with reckless attack, but with calculation. The Mongols studied their enemy. They observed supply lines, terrain, defensive patterns. They learned how the Jin fought, and, more importantly, how they failed to adapt. This was not a clash of equal worlds. It was a test of flexibility versus rigidity. The Mongol army moved, as it always had, fast, precise, unpredictable. Horse archers struck from distance, retreating before retaliation, then circling back with relentless pressure. Communication flowed through signals. Discipline held every unit together. The Jin armies, bound by heavier structure, struggled to respond. And then came the sieges. Cities were the one thing the Mongols had not mastered, at least not yet. Walls rose high, gates reinforced, defenses layered. For the first time, speed alone was not enough. The Mongols could not simply outmaneuver stone, so they adapted. Genghis Khan began incorporating engineers, captured or coerced from conquered territories. Chinese and Central Asian specialists were forced to build siege weapons, catapults, battering rams, towers. Techniques once foreign to the Mongols became part of their arsenal. They learned quickly, they always did. The result was devastating. Fortresses that had stood for generations began to fall. Cities that had never known defeat were breached. The Mongols did not just fight, they evolved with every victory. And with each victory, they became more dangerous. But it was not just their tactics that spread fear. It was their reputation. Resistance was met with annihilation, not symbolic defeat, not partial destruction, total eradication. Entire cities were wiped out, populations destroyed. Survivors, if any, carried the stories forward, stories of an army that did not negotiate, did not hesitate, did not forgive. Genghis Khan understood psychological warfare long before it had a name. Fear traveled faster than his army, and often it won battles before they began. Some cities surrendered without resistance. Those that did were spared often. Those that resisted became warnings. The campaign reached its most brutal moment at the siege of Zhengdu, a major Jin capital, modern-day Beijing. The city was strong, heavily defended, and determined to resist. It did not matter. The Mongols surrounded it, cut off supplies, waited, then struck. The siege was relentless. Fire, starvation, constant pressure. The defenders weakened. The walls, once symbols of strength, became cages, and when the city finally fell, it burned. Flames consumed what had once been a center of power. Smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles, a signal to the world that even the greatest cities were not safe. This was no longer a tribal war. This was conquest on a scale the world had rarely seen. And yet, for Genghis Khan, this was only the beginning. Because beyond the Jin dynasty lay something even greater. The vast trade networks of Central Asia, the rich cities of the Islamic world, empires that believed distance would protect them. They were wrong. The Mongol army did not slow, it expanded, each campaign feeding the next, each victory strengthening the machine. Genghis Khan had transformed his people from survivors of the steppe into conquerors of civilizations. And with each passing year, the gap between them and their enemies grew wider. Because while others fought wars, the Mongols perfected them. There was no mercy, only results. The boy who had once hidden in the river was now the architect of destruction on a continental scale. The man who had once been chained was now unchained from all limits, and the world was beginning to understand a terrifying truth. This was not a temporary force, not a passing threat. This was a storm, and it was only getting stronger. Chapter 8: Empire Expands. From the steppe to the edge of the world, the steppe was no longer enough. Genghis Khan had broken the Jin dynasty, shattered fortified cities, and proven that even walls could not stop him. But conquest creates momentum, and momentum demands continuation. To stop now would risk everything he had built. So the Mongol Empire did not pause, it advanced. To the west lay a network of wealth unlike anything on the steppe trade routes, stretching across deserts, and cities filled with gold, silk, and knowledge. At the center stood the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful state controlling key arteries of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan did not begin with war. He began with trade. He sent envoys, merchants, a message of cooperation. It was a test. The ruler of Khwarezm, Shah Muhammad II, made a fatal mistake, suspicious and arrogant. Unwilling to recognize the rising power, he ordered the execution of Mongol merchants and humiliated Genghis Khan's envoys. It was not just an insult, it was a declaration, and Genghis Khan responded, not with anger alone, but with annihilation. The invasion that followed was not a campaign. It was a systematic dismantling of an empire. Mongol forces moved with terrifying coordinations, splitting into multiple columns, striking cities simultaneously, cutting off escape routes, destroying communication. No single defense could stop them because there was no single front. The Khwarezmian Empire could not react fast enough. Cities fell one by one. Bukhara was among the first, once a center of culture and trade. It was overtaken with speed and precision. Genghis Khan stood in its mosque and declared that he was the punishment sent by heaven. Whether legend or truth, the message was clear. Then came Samarkand, stronger, richer, better defended. It did not matter. The Mongols adapted again. Siege tactics improved. Psychological pressure intensified. Defenders lost morale. Betrayal spread within the city. And when Samarkand fell, it confirmed what the world was beginning to fear. No city was safe. But the most terrifying aspect of this campaign was not just the destruction, it was the pursuit. Shah Muhammad II fled. He abandoned his empire, his armies, his people, running westward, seeking safety. Genghis Khan did not let him escape. He sent generals across thousands of kilometers, through deserts, across mountains, into lands no Mongol army had ever seen. They did not stop. They did not turn back. Eventually, the Shah died in isolation, on an island in the Caspian Sea, not defeated in battle, but hunted to the end. The empire he ruled ceased to exist, and still, the Mongols moved forward. What had begun as retaliation became expansion beyond intention. Mongol generals pushed into Persia, into the Caucasus, even brushing the edges of Eastern Europe. Armies that had once known only the grasslands were now fighting in forests, deserts, mountains, and they kept winning because the strength of the Mongols was no longer just speed or brutality. It was adaptability. They learned every terrain, every enemy, every weakness. They turned diversity into advantage. Captured engineers, foreign soldiers, local knowledge, all absorbed into the system. Nothing was wasted. Everything was used. The empire was no longer Mongol in the narrow sense. It was becoming universal. And at its center stood Genghis Khan, no longer just a conqueror of tribes or kingdoms, but a force reshaping the map of the known world. From China to Central Asia, from the edges of Persia to the distant west, a single name began to spread, not carried by diplomats, but by survivors. A name spoken in fear, a warning. Because what the Mongols brought was not just conquest, it was transformation. Trade routes shifted, cities disappeared, new systems emerged, old powers collapsed. The world was changing rapidly, violently, and yet, even as his empire stretched across continents, Genghis Khan did not slow down. He was not chasing territory. He was pursuing something larger: control, order, dominance without limit. The horizon was no longer a boundary. It was an invitation. And somewhere, far beyond the lands already conquered, more empires waited, unaware, unprepared. The storm had crossed the steppe. Now it was crossing the world. Chapter 9. Law and Order. The Yassa, the code that ruled an empire. An empire built by war cannot survive on war alone. Genghis Khan controlled lands too vast to govern through fear alone. Conquest gave him power, but power without structure collapses. Cities fell, kingdoms vanished. Now came the difficult task: control. The Mongol Empire was unlike any before. Not a single culture, people, or way of life. It stretched across deserts, mountains, cities, home to diverse peoples. To hold it together, Genghis Khan needed something stronger than tradition. He needed a system. That system became known as the Yassa. Unlike other codes, Yassa was not fixed. It was a living code, enforced with absolute authority. It governed crime, punishment, behavior, loyalty, military discipline, and daily life. It was not debated, it was obeyed. At its core, Yassa demanded one thing above all: order. Disobedience was not tolerated. Desertion meant death. Theft was punished harshly. Betrayal unforgivable. These were not just crimes. They threatened the empire's stability. Instability was the one thing Genghis Khan would not allow. But Yassa was not only about punishment, it was also about fairness. No man was above the law, not even nobles. Loyalty and service mattered more than birth. This principle, which helped Temujin rise, became the empire's foundation. Merit replaced lineage. Ability replaced privilege. For many, this was revolutionary. For others, it was terrifying, because it meant that the old world of inherited power was gone forever. The army remained the backbone of this system. Units were tightly organized, discipline enforced. Every soldier knew his role. Every commander was accountable. But governance extended far beyond the battlefield. Genghis Khan introduced systems that connected his empire in ways no one had seen before. One of the most important was the Yam, a vast relay network. Riders traveled incredible distances, carrying messages with unmatched speed. Information moved faster than ever. And in an empire this large, speed meant control. Trade, too, was protected. The Silk Road became safer under Mongol rule. Merchants were granted protection, encouraged to travel, and allowed to operate. In return, they brought wealth, knowledge, and connection. The empire did not just conquer, it connected. Religious tolerance was another unexpected pillar of Mongol rule. Genghis Khan did not enforce a single belief. What mattered was obedience. Faith was personal. Loyalty was not. This approach reduced resistance, it stabilized conquered populations, and it made the empire more adaptable. But none of this softened the reality of Mongol rule. The Yassa was absolute, punishments were swift, authority unquestioned, because Genghis Khan understood something fundamental. An empire this vast could not survive hesitation. It required clarity, consistency, and fear, controlled and present. The result was something unprecedented, a system where chaos had once ruled. For the first time, lands across continents were connected under a single authority, not just through conquest, but through governance. At its center stood a man who had once been a prisoner, now commanding history's most disciplined empire. The world began to change in ways no one could ignore. Merchants traveled farther, ideas moved faster, cultures collided and blended, and yet, beneath all of it, the foundation remained the same: absolute control. Because without the Yassa, the empire would fall, but with it, it could endure, for now. Chapter 10: The Fear of His Name. By the time the name of Genghis Khan echoed across continents, it no longer belonged to a man. It had become a force of nature. From the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, his name carried a single meaning: submit or be destroyed. The Mongol Empire was no longer just expanding, it was dominating the psychological landscape of the known world. Armies marched, not only with weapons, but with reputation. Stories traveled faster than horses. Entire cities whispered of what happened to those who resisted. They spoke of walls torn down, of populations wiped out, of fire that consumed everything. Whether every tale was true no longer mattered. Fear did the work of conquest long before the Mongol army even arrived. And that was precisely the strategy. Genghis Khan understood something few rulers ever grasped. Terror, when controlled, was more efficient than endless war. A single brutal example could save thousands of lives by convincing others not to resist at all. So when a city defied him, the punishment was absolute. But when a city surrendered, it was often spared. This duality became the foundation of Mongol dominance: mercy or annihilation, nothing in between. Across Central Asia, entire regions collapsed, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they chose not to fight. Gates opened before Mongol forces even set up their siege engines. Rulers knelt, tribute flowed, resistance faded. But where defiance remained, destruction followed. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara became symbols of Mongol power, not only because they were conquered, but because of how they were conquered. When resistance was met, it was crushed completely, leaving behind ruins that served as warnings to the rest of the world. Yet to reduce Genghis Khan to mere brutality would be a misunderstanding, because, alongside fear, he built order. Under his rule, something extraordinary began to emerge across Eurasia's vast zone of relative stability. Historians would later call the Pax Mongolica. Trade routes that had once been dangerous became secure. Merchants could travel from China to the Middle East under Mongol protection. The Silk Road flourished as never before. Caravans moved freely. Ideas spread. Technologies crossed continents. In many ways, the Mongol Empire became the first true bridge between East and West. Messengers carried information across thousands of kilometers through an advanced relay system. Laws ensured that theft and corruption were punished harshly. Religious tolerance allowed different cultures to coexist within the empire. For those who lived under Mongol rule and accepted it, life could be stable, even prosperous. But the shadow of fear never disappeared, because everyone knew what would happen if that order was challenged. The name Genghis Khan was spoken in whispers across courts and kingdoms. In some places, it was used to frighten children into obedience. In others, it was treated almost like a cursed, unstoppable force that could not be reasoned with. Kings debated how to respond. Some chose diplomacy, others prepared for war. Few truly understood what they were facing. The Mongol army was unlike anything the world had seen before. It was not bound by tradition, nor limited by geography. It moved with speed, precision, and adaptability. It learned from every enemy it defeated, adopting new technologies, new tactics, new strategies. This made it nearly impossible to predict, nearly impossible to stop. And at the center of it all was a man who had risen from nothing. Temujin, the boy who had once been abandoned on the steppe, had become the most feared name in human history. Yet even as his empire reached its height, something began to change. Genghis Khan was aging. The campaigns had never stopped, but time was relentless. His body bore the marks of decades of war. His sons and generals now carried more responsibility. The empire, once held together by his personal authority, was becoming something larger, something that would soon have to exist without him. And that raised a question no one dared to ask aloud. What happens when the man behind the fear is gone? Because fear, by its nature, is tied to presence, to reputation, to memory. Could the empire survive without the living force that had created it? Or would it fracture under its own weight? Genghis Khan did not leave that question unanswered. He had already begun preparing for the future, assigning roles to his sons, organizing the empire into structured divisions, ensuring that the system would endure beyond his lifetime. But even the strongest systems depend on those who control them, and no one could truly replace him. Still, the campaigns continued, because for Genghis Khan, there was no such thing as enough. There was always another horizon, another kingdom, another act of defiance waiting to be crushed. And so, even as his legend reached its peak, even as the world trembled at the sound of his name, he turned his attention to one final enemy, a kingdom that had once submitted and then dared to defy him. It would not be forgiven. It would not be forgotten. It would be destroyed. Chapter 11. The Final Campaign. The world already feared his name, but Genghis Khan was not finished. Fear, to him, was not a destination, it was a tool. And, like any tool, it had to be maintained, reinforced, proven again and again. Empires did not survive on reputation alone. They survived on action, on consequence, on the unbreakable certainty that defiance would always be punished. And now there was defiance. The kingdom of Western Shia had once bowed before him. They had submitted, accepted Mongol authority, and been spared. But when the Khan called upon them to support his campaigns, they refused. Too many rulers. This might have been a political disagreement. To Genghis Khan, it was betrayal. And betrayal, in his world, could not exist. By the time he launched the campaign, he was no longer the young warlord who had united the tribes. His hair had grayed, his body carried the weight of decades of war. But his will remained unchanged. He would lead the campaign himself. The Mongol army moved south and west, cutting across unforgiving lands. The Gobi Desert stretched before them like an endless test of endurance. Winds howled across empty horizons. Heat burned through armor by day, while cold pierced bone at night. Horses collapsed because the Khan did not turn back. He rode at the front, as he always had. Not because he needed to, but because it reminded his army of who he was and why they followed him. As they advanced into Western Shia territory, the pattern repeated itself. Cities faced a choice: surrender or be destroyed. Many remembered what had happened to others who resisted. Gates opened, tributes were offered, lives were spared. But not all chose submission. Some cities held their ground, trusting in their walls, their numbers, their desperation. They believed the Mongols could be stopped. They were wrong. Siege engines thundered against stone. Fire arrows darkened the sky. Mongol tactics adapted to every defense, undermining walls, cutting supply lines, breaking morale. When the walls fell, there was no mercy left to give. Each destroyed city was not just a victory, it was a message. The deeper the Mongols pushed, the more relentless the campaign became. But within the command ranks, something began to shift. The generals noticed it first, then the soldiers. The Khan was changing. He still gave orders with clarity, still saw the battlefield with unmatched precision. But time had begun to claim its price. His movements were slower, his silences longer. The endless campaigns that had once seemed to fuel him now seemed to drain him. And then, during the campaign, something happened. The exact truth was never recorded with certainty. Some accounts claim he fell from his horse during a hunt. Others suggest he was wounded in battle. A few whisper of illness that struck without warning. What is known is simple. Genghis Khan began to weaken, but he did not stop. From horseback, then from within his command tent, and finally from his bed, he continued to lead. Orders were issued, strategies refined. The army moved with the same precision as always, if his will alone still drove every action. Because, in many ways, it did. The final objective stood before them, the capital of Western Shia, a city that refused to kneel. The Mongols surrounded it completely. No one entered, no one escaped. Supply lines were severed. Hope was slowly suffocated. Siege engines were assembled. The sky filled with arrows and smoke. Inside the Mongol camp, the atmosphere grew heavier, not with fear of the enemy, but with something far more unsettling. Uncertainty. Inside his tent, the man who had conquered continents lay dying. Generals gathered, awaiting commands that might be his last. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations. Genghis Khan did not need them. His entire life had already spoken for him. He gave only what was necessary. The city must fall. The betrayal must be punished. The campaign must not stop, even if he did. And then, quietly, almost as if the world itself refused to acknowledge it, the greatest conqueror of the steppe reached the end of his journey. No horns sounded. No empire paused. Genghis Khan died as he had lived in his final years, within motion, within war, within purpose. His death was kept secret. The army could not know, not yet, not until the final command had been fulfilled. The illusion of his presence remained intact. Orders continued. The siege intensified. The Mongol war machine did not falter. And then the walls broke. The capital of Western Shia fell. What followed was not just conquest, it was eradication. The kingdom that had dared to defy him was wiped from history with ruthless precision. Its destruction became one final, undeniable statement. Even death did not stop Genghis Khan's will. Only after victory was secured did the truth begin to spread. The Khan was gone. His body was carried away in secrecy, escorted across the vast empire he had forged. Legends would later claim that those who guarded his funeral procession killed anyone who crossed their path, ensuring that the location of his burial would remain forever unknown. No tomb, no monument, no marked grave. The man who had ruled the world returned to the earth without a trace. Yet nothing truly ended, because what he had built could not simply disappear. His sons would continue his campaigns. His generals would carry forward his strategies. The empire would expand even further, reaching lands he had never seen. But something had changed. The force that had held everything together, the man himself, was gone. And the question that had lingered in silence now stood before the world. Could the empire survive without him? Or would it become something else entirely? Legacy of Fire. When Genghis Khan died, the world did not breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. Empires built on fear do not simply vanish when the man who created that fear disappears. They echo, expand, and evolve. Sometimes they become even more powerful. At his death, the Mongol Empire was already the largest contiguous empire in history. But what made it truly extraordinary was this: it was unfinished. Genghis Khan built a system, a machine of war, governance, and mobility. It could continue without him. Now, that system would be tested. His sons inherited not just land, but momentum. Ogedei Khan, his third son, took the title of Great Khan. Unlike his father, Gedai was an administrator of a vast empire. He understood one truth: to stop expanding was to invite collapse. And so, the conquests continued. Under Gedai's command, Mongol armies surged westward into Eastern Europe. Cities fell. Kingdoms in Europe trembled. The Mongols reached Hungary and Poland, defeating forces with tactics that shattered empires in Asia. To the west, the Golden Horde emerged from conquest's ashes. It would dominate Eastern Europe and Russia for generations. To the east, another transformation. Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire became a center of administration, culture, and global exchange, not just destruction. This was the second phase of Genghis Khan's legacy. Not conquest, control. Under Mongol rule, the vast lands of Eurasia entered a period historians would later call the Pax Mongolica, a time when trade routes flourished, communication accelerated, and ideas moved across continents with unprecedented speed. Merchants traveled safely from China to the Middle East. Scholars exchanged knowledge across cultures. Technologies spread: paper, gunpowder, printing, reshaping civilizations far beyond Mongol borders. In this way, Genghis Khan's empire did something no empire before it had ever achieved. It connected the world. But legacy is never simple, because the same empire that enabled trade also brought destruction. The same armies that protected merchants had once annihilated cities. The same name that represented order also carried the memory of terror. Even generations after his death, people still spoke of him with a mixture of awe and fear. In some places, he was remembered as a unifier, a man who ended tribal conflict and created stability. In others, he was seen as a destroyer, unstoppable force that left ruin in his wake. Both were true. Genghis Khan did not belong to a single narrative. He was not just a hero, not just a villain. He was something far more complex, a turning point in human history. Over time, the empire he created began to fracture. The vast distances, the competing ambitions of his descendants, and the sheer scale of the territory made unity difficult. The empire split into khanates, each powerful but no longer united under a single will. And yet, even in fragmentation, his influence remained. Because what Genghis Khan had changed was not just borders. He had changed the way empires functioned. He had shown that mobility could defeat tradition, that discipline could overcome numbers, that a man born into nothing could reshape the world. His story began with a child named Temujin, abandoned, hunted, a boy who learned that survival required strength, that trust was fragile, and that power had to be taken, not given. That boy became Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan became a legend. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his legacy is this: he left no palace behind him, no grand tomb, no monument carved in his name. The greatest conqueror in history vanished into the earth, his burial place unknown, his physical presence erased. And yet, he was never gone, because his true monument was not built of stone. It was built of history itself. In the borders, he redrew. In the empires, he shattered. In the connections he created between distant worlds. Fire destroys, but it also. Genghis Khan was both, and the world that exists today still carries the marks of the fire he unleashed.